Hello, and welcome to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening. This is the first episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled The Orphan. Early in the morning of May 20th, 1834, Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, died peacefully in his Parisian residence at the age of 76. Throughout his life, the hero of two worlds, as some called him, had played pivotal roles in the history of both France and the United States, becoming a household name in both countries. In the United States, news of his passing prompted Congress to declare a 30-day period of mourning nationwide. Flags were lowered to half-mast, the halls of the Capitol were draped in black, and at every military base in the country a 21-gun salute was fired in his honor. All American citizens were encouraged to wear mourning dress for the next several days. In France, the scene was quite different. The king, Louis Philippe, wary of civil unrest, prohibited the public from participating in the old general's funeral procession. Crowds of would-be demonstrators were kept at a distance from the funeral cortege by a battalion of soldiers, bayonets fixed. A journalist writing for the liberal newspaper called The National provided the following description, quote, "No one dared approach. Indeed, the spirit of Lafayette must have been indignant. The true friend of liberty was separated from the people by bayonets and sabers. The terrifying precautions and insulting deployment of troops transformed the capital into a city at war. The cemetery was under a state of siege. A mourning public faced a force of artillery larger than would be deployed against a foreign invasion." End quote. Later that year, during a joint session of the United States Congress, former President John Quincy Adams delivered an official eulogy for Lafayette, which, in his typical fashion, went on for 3 hours. The section that is quoted most often, though, is the following. Quote, "Pronounce him as one of the first men of his age, and you have not yet done him justice. Try him by the test by which he sought in vain to simulate the vulgar and selfish spirit of Napoleon. Class him among the men who, to compare and seat themselves, must take in the compass of all ages. Turn back your eyes upon the records of time. Summon from the creation of the world to this day the mighty deed of every age and every climate, and where, among the race of merely mortal men, shall one be found who, as the benefactor of his kind, shall claim to take precedence of Lafayette? Lafayette discovered no new principles of politics or of morals. He invented nothing in science, he disclosed no new phenomenon in the laws of nature. Born and educated in the highest order of the feudal nobility, under the most absolute monarchy of Europe, in possession of an affluent fortune, and master of himself and all of his capabilities, at the moment of attaining manhood, the principle of republican justice and of social equality took possession of his heart and mind, as if inspired from above. He devoted himself, his life, his fortune, his hereditary honors, his towering ambition, his splendid hopes, all to the cause of liberty. He came to another hemisphere to defend it. He became one of the most effective champions of our independence, but that once achieved, he returned to his own country, and thenceforward took no part in the controversies which have divided us. In the events of our revolution, and in the forms of policy which we have adopted for the establishment and perpetuation of our freedom, Lafayette found the most perfect form of government. He wished to add nothing to it. He would have gladly abstracted nothing from it. Instead of the imaginary republic of Plato or the utopia of Sir Thomas More, he took a more practical, existing model in actual operation here, and never attempted or wished more than to apply it faithfully to his own country." End quote. No similarly effusive pronouncements about the Marquis emanated from the country of his birth. Instead, this passage from the romantic author François-René de Chateaubriand reflects the more muddled legacy he left behind among the people of France. Quote, "Monsieur de Lafayette is celebrated simply because he survived. There is a fame that arises spontaneously, based on talent, which death enhances by arresting that talent in youth. But there is another kind of fame, a tardy offspring of time which is the product of age, deficient itself in greatness. It is so because of the revolutions in the midst of which it is placed by chance. The bearer of such a fame, by dint of existing throughout, becomes involved in everything. His name becomes the insignia, or the banner of all. The results of his actions, in a most extraordinary manner, were often in contradiction to his ideals, a royalist, in 1789 he overthrew a monarchy 8 centuries old. A republican in 1830, he created a monarchy of the barricades. Molded by events, his image will be found when the alluvia of our misfortunes settle, embedded in the revolutionary sediment. In the New World, Monsieur de Lafayette contributed to the creation of a new society. In the Old World, to the destruction of an old one. Freedom invokes him in Washington just as anarchy does in Paris. Monsieur de Lafayette had only one idea, and, happily for him, it was that of the century. The fixity of that idea created his empire. It served to blinker him, it prevented him from looking to the right or to the left. He marched with a firm step on a single track. He advanced without tumbling over precipices, not because he saw them, but because he did not. Blindness took the place of genius in him. Everything fixed is fatal, and whatever is fatal is powerful." End quote. For better and for worse, Lafayette played a central role in the history of both France and the United States, and is a significant figure in the period sometimes referred to as the Age of Revolutions. His actions helped alter the course of history, and in this series of the Perspectives in History podcast, I intend to give a comprehensive account of the life and times of the Marquis de Lafayette. Our narrative will take us through some of the most important events of the American and French revolutions, and in doing so, it's my hope that you will gain a better understanding not just of the events of Lafayette's life, but of the broader context in which they took place. So, on that note, I'd like to officially welcome you back. The podcast is out of hiatus, and we're beginning a new series. Now, I know I previously said that the next series would be about the Fourth Crusade, but once again I found the edits I had to make to the script I wrote the first draft of in 2021 were far too extensive for it to be ready to record by this time. I'm still working on the script though, rest assured, and I'm hoping it will be ready by the time this series wraps up, which, given that this script is 14 parts long at present, should end in March of next year. After the Fourth Crusade, though, I'm not sure what topic will be next on the docket. I have a few scripts that are more or less complete and ready to be produced, including one about the last emperor of China, Fuye, and one about the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. There are also many more that I have started but haven't yet completed. For instance, one about the radical abolitionist John Brown, one about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, and one about the late Ottoman Empire. As always, if there's a specific topic you'd like to hear about on the show, I'm always open to suggestions. Though, given the length of the production process, it would probably be quite a while before it gets released. Speaking of which, I'm sure a few of you are wondering what happened to the final episode of the series on the Korean War. The answer is that I had to take a break from writing the script since I got so burned out a few months ago, but I'm planning to pick it up again and take another look at it with fresh eyes and get it finished quickly. Stay tuned for further updates, and again, I'm sorry the release schedule got so out of whack last season. I'll do my best to ensure that this doesn't happen again. That's all I had to say regarding housekeeping at the top of the show, so let's move on. Before we begin our narrative in earnest, though, let's take a few moments to discuss sources. If you look at the bibliography included in the description of this episode or on the website, you will notice that I have listed 9 titles, of which only one appears to be a primary source, that being the memoirs, correspondences, and manuscripts of General Lafayette, with the author credited as the man himself, albeit with his legal full name, which is quite long and I won't attempt to rattle off again. Take a look for yourself if you're so inclined. This is a collection of documents written by Lafayette that were compiled by his family and published in a series of 6 volumes in 1837, a few years after his death. The title is somewhat misleading since Lafayette never wrote a proper memoir, and the most we have are some relatively brief autobiographical writings. For the most part, the documents included in these volumes are his correspondence or letters. The letters included are just those authored by him, while some letters he was the intended recipient of are also reproduced here. There seems to have been no metric for deciding which of these were included aside from whatever the editors deemed to be important. That brings me to another point I'd like to make regarding the source, that being that other historians who have actually been through the archives where the original documents are stored have noted that his family, under whose auspices they were published, did choose to leave out certain documents they felt portrayed Lafayette in a less than positive light. That said, this is still an invaluable collection for anyone interested in Lafayette's life to work with, as the entirety of his life is covered by these 6 volumes. The first volume is made up of material from the time of the American Revolution, the second and third deal with the French Revolution, the fourth covers his imprisonment after 1792, the fifth deals with his retirement, and the sixth details his return to the political stage during the Revolution of 1830 until his death. Moving on to secondary sources, specifically biographies, I'll start by mentioning that there are quite a lot of Lafayette biographies out there, many of which are quite old. As you can see, 2 of these biographies, the one by Woodward and that by Fuye and Babeau, were published in 1938 and 1956, respectively. These can still be useful as sources, since they occasionally include details that later biographers leave out, but they do not reflect the current state of research and should be read with that in mind. As for biographies written this century, there are 3 that I used for my research. Lafayette by Harlow Giles Unger, The Marquis, Lafayette Reconsidered by Laura Auricchio, and Hero of Two Worlds by Mike Duncan, each of which has its own strengths and weaknesses. By way of a disclaimer, I will say that I am a big fan of Mike Duncan, and he was personally a big inspiration for me when I first started this podcast, so I may be predisposed to look at his book in a more generous light, even if it isn't the most, for lack of a better word, academic. It's still quite accessible and well-researched regardless. Auricchio's book takes a unique perspective as it focuses more on aspects of art and material culture that other biographies don't usually cover. As for Unger's book, it's more of a straightforward biography, more similar to the older sources listed here in terms of what topics it chooses to emphasize. Lloyd Kramer's book, Lafayette in Two Worlds, Public Cultures and Personal Identities in an Age of Revolutions, is not a straightforward biography as it deals more with issues of public perception and memory and historiography than anything else. Even so, it was still a useful source in this series since it sort of tries to zoom out to look at the bigger picture, so to speak. The final 2 sources listed in the bibliography are Citizens, a Chronicle of the French Revolution by Simon Schama, and The Expanding Blaze, How the American Revolution Ignited the World, 1775 to 1848, by Jonathan Israel. Neither of these were books I picked up specifically for the purposes of this project, but were ones I already owned and thought were relevant to the subject. Citizens is an incredibly detailed and comprehensive account of the French Revolution, and it is, in my opinion, the best single-volume history of the subject out there. It's quite lengthy, but it's very narrative-driven and quite readable. And since our protagonist was caught up in many of these events that the author describes, it was useful for my purposes here. As for Israel's book, The Expanding Blaze, it covers the Atlantic revolutions, meaning not just the events that took place in America and France in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but also in places like Haiti, Ireland, Poland, Greece, and others, with the focus being on how the American Revolution influenced similar liberal revolutions during the period. Given Lafayette's connection to the United States, he's a figure that gets mentioned quite frequently, and overall the book is helpful for understanding the various strains of liberal political thought at the time, and where our protagonist fits into the larger scheme of things. That's all I have to say about sources for now, so without further ado, let's begin the narrative. Lafayette was born on September 6th, 1757 to Michel du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, and his wife, Marie-Louise de la Rivière, in the Château de Chavaniac. Located in the Auvergne region of south-central France, Chavaniac was initially constructed by Lafayette's ancestors in the 14th century. Though it was partially destroyed by a fire half a century prior to Lafayette's birth, those who rebuilt it made no effort to reconstruct the chateau in alignment with the more fashionable classical revival stylings that were popular in Paris and other large French cities at the time. The same house in which Lafayette was born is still standing today, and appears to be an anachronistically medieval construction, described by authors as being, quote, Spartan, utilitarian, and fortress-like, end quote. The village of Chavaniac itself was no more impressive, consisting at the time of about a dozen or so houses, all gathered around the chateau. The region of Auvergne had, and still has to this day, a reputation as somewhat of a rustic, sparsely populated backwater. Auvergne's capital, Clermont-Ferrand, had a population of about 30,000 by the time of Lafayette's birth. But, back to him himself, shortly after his birth, Lafayette was baptized in the local parish church, with his full name being Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier. Lengthy baptismal names were common among French nobility, but the length of Lafayette's own name struck him as unusual. As he later wrote, quote, "It's not my fault I was baptized like a Spaniard, with the name of every conceivable saint who might offer me protection in battle. So large a proportion of fathers and sons were killed on the battlefield that the family's misfortunes in war became sort of a proverb throughout the province." End quote. Lafayette's lineage was impressive, and there were indeed many warriors among his ancestors. He claimed to be able to trace his lineage back over 700 years. One of his ancestors, Paul Motier de Lafayette, fought in the ill-fated Seventh Crusade. In 1428, Lafayette's namesake, Gilbert III Motier de Lafayette, fought against the English alongside Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War, becoming a Marshal of France for his efforts. Another notable ancestor of Lafayette was the Madame de Lafayette, a celebrated novelist and author of the 1678 novel The Princess of Cleves, widely considered to be a pioneering work in the field of psychological literature. However, as illustrious as this all sounds, Lafayette's father belonged to a junior branch of the family, only happening to inherit the title of Marquis due to an unfortunate, or as he probably saw it, fortunate, series of untimely deaths in the family. Roche Gilbert, the older brother of Lafayette's father Michel, met his demise at the young age of 18 during the War of Polish Succession, when he was shot in the back by an Austrian prisoner whose pistol he had neglected to confiscate. Lafayette's grandfather, Edouard du Motier, was a personal bodyguard to the King of France, but he died in a horse-riding accident near Versailles in 1740. Thus, the titles of Marquis de Lafayette and Lord of Chavaniac passed to Lafayette's father Michel. Despite his noble birth, the branch of the family into which Lafayette was born was not the most wealthy. Michel was a smart man, however, and chose his wife well. In 1754, he married Julie de la Rivière. The family from which Lafayette's mother hailed, the de la Rivière family, had, much like the Lafayettes, enjoyed a noble status for centuries, but unlike them, they were wealthier and had better connections in the French government. Julie's father, the Comte de la Rivière, was a brilliant military officer who had been a member of the chivalric order of Saint-Louis, one of the highest honors that the King of France could bestow upon one of his subjects. Julie's mother had been a lady-in-waiting to Madame Adelaide, the daughter of King Louis XV, while her father had put his efforts towards the maintenance and expansion of the family's estates in the Brittany region of northern France. Julie herself had spent much of her early life living in the family's grand apartments in the Luxembourg Palace, in the heart of Paris. At the time of their marriage, Julie was still living in the city. For both families involved, the marriage of Julie and Michel was beneficial. For Michel, his new family ties offered him opportunities to advance his career in the military, while for the Rivières, they were more than willing to offer their daughter's hand to a rustic nobleman who would be willing to accept a modest dowry. Of course, it helped that the pair seemed to have taken a genuine liking to each other. On the eve of Lafayette's birth, a dispute between the European states of Austria and Prussia over the territory of Silesia in what is now Poland sparked a new war that spread across 3 different continents and which involved most of the world's great powers. This conflict is known as the 7 Years' War, though American listeners may know it as the French and Indian War. The conflict between France and Great Britain in the North American theater had begun in 1754, 3 years before Lafayette's birth, when a company of British colonial militia, led by a 22-year-old colonel named George Washington, ambushed a detachment of French colonial soldiers at the Battle of Jumonville Glen. When the war broke out on the European continent between Austria and Prussia, the war between their respective allies, France and Britain, became intertwined with the conflict in Europe. Thanks to his marital alliance with the Rivière family, Michel had been awarded a position as a colonel in an elite regiment of grenadiers. In mid-1757, Michel's regiment was sent to fight in Germany. He left his pregnant wife in the care of his widowed mother, Marie Catherine de Chavaniac. For the next 2 years, Michel served his country on the front lines, only able to make brief visits home to his mother, wife, and the son that had been born in his absence. He wrote home frequently. One such letter, dated July 1759, reads in part, quote, "We are always in the greatest tranquility. I send this to you with as much pleasure as in the hope of calming your worries. The enemy is in the same position, and we have an unassailable camp. As we are not in any of the great sieges to be made, you can, my dear mother, be in the greatest security on my account." End quote. Despite these reassuring words, he would be dead within a month. The last words he ever wrote home were, quote, "I kiss my son." End quote. Shortly after sending this letter, the French army was on the move, and on August 1st, Michel's regiment found itself in the middle of one of the largest battles of the war, the Battle of Minden. During the battle, Michel was killed by a direct hit from a British cannon. Many sources report, perhaps with a bit of dramatic exaggeration, that he was, quote, "literally blown to pieces," end quote. He was 27 years old at the time of his death. His son had hardly had a chance to get to know him. He left behind his wife Julie and the aforementioned 2-year-old son, who, thanks to the laws of succession, now bore his father's old title, the Marquis de Lafayette. Distraught over the death of her husband, Julie, then pregnant with her second child, went to live with her parents in Paris, leaving young Lafayette behind in Chavaniac to be cared for by his grandmother. Despite a dead father and an absentee mother, Lafayette, by all accounts, had a happy childhood. His grandmother, Madame Chavaniac, was an excellent caretaker, renowned locally for her prudence and generosity. Moreover, she took an active role in trying to better the family's financial situation and ensuring that there was enough money left to guarantee her grandson a quality education. Michel's death had left his son in a somewhat precarious situation financially. His campaigns, for which he was expected to personally foot the bill for provisioning the men under his command, nearly bankrupted the family. The fact that he had died without having written a will also complicated matters, as the family's fortune reverted back to the Riviere family. Shortly after Michel's death, Madame Chavaniac wrote to King Louis XV personally, requesting to be granted a pension, which she was given. Shortly after his mother's departure, Lafayette and his grandmother were joined at the chateau by 2 of his aunts, Madeleine and Charlotte, the former of whom had never married and the latter of whom was a widow. Charlotte brought along her daughter, Louise, who was only a year older than Lafayette. He came to regard Louise as his sister. Of her, Lafayette would later write, quote, "Never did brother and sister love each other more tenaciously," end quote. When Lafayette was 5 years old, Madame Chavaniac, using the pension afforded her by the king, hired a local Jesuit priest named the Abbé Féon to tutor the boy. The priest not only taught Lafayette grammar and arithmetic, but also introduced him to classical Greek and Roman literature, as was par for the course at the time. A favorite of young Lafayette was Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars. In particular, he idolized Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who united the various tribes of Gaul to oppose the Roman invasion. Vercingetorix hailed from the Auvergne tribe, from which the name of the province Auvergne is derived. The Battle of Gergovia, the most famous Gallic victory in the war, occurred near Clermont-Ferrand, less than 100 miles north of Chavaniac. Young Lafayette loved such tales of heroic feats, whether it was from his tutor, recounting the tale of Gallic resistance to Roman rule in the 50s BCE, or if it was from his grandmother, regaling the boy with stories of the martial deeds of his own ancestors. Of his childhood, Lafayette would later write, quote, "From the time I was 8, I longed for glory. I remember nothing of my childhood more than my fervor for tales of glory and my plans to travel the world in quest of fame." End quote. In the loving embrace of his family, and under the tutelage of the Abbé Féon, Lafayette began to show remarkable promise for a boy of such a young age. As an elder cousin of his observed, quote, "The young lord of the house is singularly well informed for his age, remarkable for his thinking, wisdom, discretion, self-control, and his powers of judgment." End quote. Having said all this cousin also noted that he could, quote, "detect the seed of self-esteem, maybe even ambition," end quote. At the age of 10, Lafayette recognized a prime opportunity to go forth from his home and win some fame for himself. For the past 3 years, rumors had made their way through the rural communes of south-central France of the Beast of Gévaudan, a predator, speculated to have been a hyena or a wolf, that roamed the countryside, killing hundreds of women and children and untold numbers of livestock. Modern historians now believe that an unusually overabundant population of wolves were responsible for these attacks, and that the so-called Beast of Gévaudan was a classic example of mass hysteria. Nonetheless, tales of the beast's butchery prompted many hunters to venture into the forests of Auvergne to confront the creature. 10-year-old Lafayette included. Gathering a loyal troop of local boys his age, Lafayette snatched his father's old musket from the mantel and marched off into the woods in pursuit of the beast. When his tutor and aunts tried to chase after him, Lafayette responded that he was the lord of the village and that it was his personal responsibility to protect it, but to his great disappointment, he was unable to track down the beast. In 1768, at the age of 11, Lafayette was summoned by his mother to join her in Paris. Despite his self-professed desire to travel the world, Lafayette was anxious to venture out from his home, from the comfort of his grandmother, aunts, and cousin. He simply had not known another life outside of Chavaniac, and the contrast between Chavaniac and Paris could not be more pronounced. Chavaniac was a village of less than 100 people, while, at this time, the population of Paris was nearly 700,000, making it one of the most populated cities in Europe, second only to London. While Chavaniac was a village still mired in the traditions of medieval feudalism, Paris, on the other hand, was the center of European high culture. Lafayette began to get a real notion of how much life was about to change for him during the 2-day-long carriage ride to the capital. As they traveled north, Lafayette noticed that the men that they encountered along the way did not make the customary signs of deference to his positions that he was used to. In Chavaniac, everyone knew Lafayette and treated him with the reverence afforded him by his noble status. Outside of it, he was quickly forced to come to terms with the fact that to other people he was, despite his rank, no one special. Upon arriving in Paris, Lafayette was escorted to his new home, the Palais du Luxembourg. Constructed in 1616 for Marie de Medici, the wife of King Henri IV, the palace is a spectacular monument to Renaissance architecture. Built in the Italianate style, the palace is best known for its sprawling 62 acres worth of meticulously maintained gardens. No doubt this was a strange new world for the young Lafayette, but luckily for him, his mother Julie was there to help him navigate it. Despite their long estrangement, the two would form a very close bond over the coming years. Also accompanying Lafayette to Paris was his tutor, the Abbé Féon, who soon discovered that the intellectual and social trends of Paris were every bit as foreign to him as they were to his young ward. If he was to become a Parisian noble, as his mother desired him to be, Lafayette required further education that the Abbé Féon simply could not provide. This is not to say that he had failed in any way in his duties to the young boy. He had done his very best to provide him with the traditional education that was befitting of a rural nobleman. He had taught Lafayette the history of his lineage, as well as enough Greek and Latin to comprehend classical literature, not to mention basic skills like grammar and arithmetic. But at this time, French society, as was European society more broadly, undergoing a revolutionary paradigm shift in the intellectual sphere. Known as the Enlightenment, this was a movement in which public thinkers radically challenged the status quo, questioning the very foundations upon which the old order had been built, including the nature of education. Enlightenment philosophers believed that the ultimate purpose of education was to instill virtue. In his highly influential treatise on education, aptly titled Treatise on Education, Charles Rollin, a rector at the esteemed University of Paris, wrote, quote, "Virtue alone puts men in a position to fill public offices. It is virtue that gives man the taste for true and solid glory, which inspires in him love of the fatherland and a desire to serve it well, which always teaches him to prefer the public good to private good." End quote. What Rollin was implying in this passage is that hailing from an illustrious lineage would no longer be sufficient to achieve public office in itself, and to acquire the power and prestige associated with it. Merit alone, he argued, should allow one to advance in society. One's merit, in turn, was largely determined by one's education. In the schools, like the one Lafayette would eventually attend, the curriculum was made up of a curious mixture of old and new. Students were educated in the latest developments in rapidly emerging fields of natural science and philosophy, and read works from contemporary figures like Newton, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. The other half of the curriculum would consist of readings from ancient Greece and Rome that went beyond the usual works like the Iliad and the Odyssey with which Lafayette was already familiar. They read philosophical tracts by authors like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Livy, and Plutarch. Steeped in these sorts of readings, in both the scientific, skeptical, and rationalistic thought of the Enlightenment thinkers, and in the moral and political virtuousness of the ancient authors, students of this period naturally came to see the contradictions inherent in their own society. It isn't for no reason that this next generation of students would go on to spearhead the revolutionary upheavals of the coming decades. But back to the matter at hand, the Enlightenment philosophers' fixation on meritocracy, which to a degree was being adopted by the government, left nobles like Lafayette in a somewhat precarious position. Lafayette came from the ranks of the so-called nobility of the sword, which was a title used to designate noblemen who had acquired their status from generations of loyal military service to the king. The nobles of the sword were distinguished from their counterparts, the nobles of the robe, in that the latter group derived their status from positions in the bureaucracy. In the late 18th century, the nobility of the sword began to decline in prominence, while the nobility of the robe was on the ascent. Lafayette's relatives, in particular his mother, placed great hopes on his potential to increase the family's power and prestige by way of a career in the civil service. To this end, Lafayette's grandfather had him enrolled in the Collège du Plessis, a secondary school under the jurisdiction of the University of Paris. Here, a great majority of Lafayette's classmates hailed from the nobility of the robe, but a few were members of the Third Estate, commoners who had been given scholarships to attend the school based on merit. It was among his peers at the Collège du Plessis that Lafayette first began to demonstrate his propensity for leadership. He quickly fell in with a group of fellow students who he later described as, quote, "my disciples, who would have fiercely defended me if there ever was a need," end quote. The 4 years Lafayette spent at the Collège du Plessis helped shape him into the man that he would become in more ways than one. He was by all accounts a highly motivated student. In particular, the study of Latin proved to be somewhat of a forte of his. While his study of the Latin classics won him school-wide recognition on at least one occasion, on a deeper level, Lafayette took the moral lessons of these works to heart. These writings, a great many of which date to Rome's Republican period, imbibed in the young, impressionable Lafayette a certain love of liberty that was at odds with the highly stratified and autocratic society in which he currently lived. Again, it's worth noting that Lafayette's experience in this regard was not unique. As one of his contemporaries, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, wrote, quote, "Once I read Livy, I became a Republican among Republicans," end quote. However, Lafayette was never able to dispense with his dreams of winning military glory. He later recalled of having a, quote, "burning desire to wear a uniform," end quote. This did not go unnoticed by his family, and at age 13, his great-grandfather, the Comte de la Rivière, secured for him a position in the Black Musketeers, the king's bodyguard. Although the position, and indeed the regiment itself, was largely ceremonial, Lafayette took great pride in his position, all the more because it afforded him the rare opportunity to come face-to-face with the king himself, if even for a brief moment. On the 3rd of April, 1770, Lafayette's mother, Julie, died at the age of 32. She had been ill for quite some time, but her condition suddenly took a turn for the worse in mid-March. Lafayette was only 12 years old at the time, and he was devastated. Though they had been separated for much of his early childhood, in the 2 years since they had been reunited, Lafayette and his mother had reforged a strong bond. She had been the greatest source of his emotional and psychological strength in this new, strange, and unforgiving world that was 18th century Parisian society. This would have been a grim enough time in Lafayette's life as it was, but then, a few weeks later, the tragedy was compounded by the subsequent death of his grandfather, a death attributed to his grief. As the Comte de la Rivière's closest living relative, Lafayette inherited the family's extensive landholdings in Brittany, properties which grossed about 60,000 livres annually. Lafayette was already bringing in 18,000 livres annually from his estates in Auvergne, and when revenues from the family's other various investments were factored in, this came out to an income of over 120,000 livres annually. This is about $1.2 million in today's currency. For context, in this period, a common agricultural laborer might have been expected to make about 1,000 livres in the course of their entire lifetime. An income as enormous as that which Lafayette now found himself in possession of could only be attained by the highest rungs of the nobility. And at just 12 years old, Lafayette had suddenly become one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire kingdom. Although the grief-stricken child couldn't have been fully capable of appreciating this fact at the time, this inheritance was about to change his life in ways that few could have anticipated. Lafayette's newfound fortune also made him the most eligible bachelor in the entire kingdom, despite his young age. It wouldn't be long before noble families would come calling on him, seeking to offer the hands of their daughters in marriage. One of the first of these families was the Noailles. The House of Noailles was one of the wealthiest and most prestigious in all of France. Of them, American diplomat and future President John Adams would write that during a visit to France he, quote, was very inquisitive concerning the great family of Noailles, and I was told by some of the most intelligent men in France that there were no less than 6 marshals of France from this family alone, that they held so many offices under the king that they received 18 million livres annually. This family, in short, was more powerful than the royal house of Bourbon, end quote. The patriarch of the family, Jean de Noailles, the Duc d'Ayen, who I will henceforth refer to as the Duc d'Ayen, was a renowned chemist and a prominent member of the royal court. But despite their impressive status, the family found themselves in a difficult situation. In his marriage to his wife Henriette, the Duc d'Ayen had produced 5 daughters, whom he loved deeply to be sure, but no sons. In a society still governed by the laws of primogeniture, this spelled trouble. If the Duke was to propagate the family, he would have to find eligible suitors for his 5 daughters to marry. Already one such candidate, a second cousin, had been chosen to marry Louise, the eldest of the 5. By marrying his second daughter, Adrienne, to the young Marquis de Lafayette, the Duke saw an opportunity to better secure the future of his house. The bargain was equally advantageous to Lafayette as it was to his would-be father-in-law. Ties with the powerful and influential Noailles family would provide Lafayette with opportunities to make connections in high places he simply would not have been able to on his own. There was one major obstacle that prevented the Duke from sealing the deal, however: his wife Henriette, the Duchesse d'Ayen. She was none too pleased that her husband was seeking to have Adrienne married off at such a young age. As I'm sure many of you are aware, it was common practice among European nobility in this period to marry relatively young, though 12 was definitely on the lower end of the socially acceptable age range. The Duchesse d'Ayen was very protective of her children and would not allow Adrienne to be married before she had the opportunity to grow as a woman in her own right. The Duchess refused to give her consent to the arrangement, at least at first. After a few months of back-and-forth negotiation, she finally agreed to a compromise. She would allow the marriage to go forward only on the conditions that the engagement be prolonged for at least 2 years, and that neither Lafayette nor Adrienne would be informed of the engagement until shortly before the wedding was to take place. And so, in February 1773, Lafayette was invited to move into the Noailles family residence at Versailles. If the young Lafayette had found Paris to be intimidating, Versailles would be even more so. The Palace of Versailles, which has become a byword for European high culture, was constructed during the reign of the Sun King, Louis XIV, and had served as the center of power in the Kingdom of France ever since. The culture at Versailles revolved around an intricate but largely unwritten code of conduct that each resident was expected to abide by at all times. To learn this elaborate set of routines and rituals, Lafayette's new surrogate family had him enrolled at a new school, the Académie de Versailles. Unlike his old institution of learning, the curriculum at this school was not focused on what we would consider to be traditional subjects. Rather, the students there were taught the various skills they would need to know to conduct themselves properly at court, things like horseback riding, swordsmanship, dancing, and conversational etiquette. For the other students at the academy, they had been immersed in the court culture of Versailles for most, or in some cases, all of their lives, and skills like those that I just listed were like second nature to them. Lafayette, on the other hand, having grown up in the rustic countryside of Auvergne, struggled to make the adjustment. The Comte de la Marque, one of Lafayette's classmates at the academy, observed of him, quote, "He was very awkward in all of his ways. He danced without grace and rode badly. And the young men with whom he lived were more skillful than he in exercises of the body that were then in fashion." End quote. He also struggled to fit in socially. At Versailles, he was constantly surrounded by noble peers who surpassed him in nearly every respect, in power, pedigree, wealth, education, and so on. Lafayette soon earned a reputation for being, according to one of his friends, quote, "cold and serious in his bearing, which sometimes created a false impression of timidity and embarrassment." End quote. It did not help that Lafayette refused to participate in the endless gossip that abounded in day-to-day interactions between the denizens of Versailles. Lafayette saw himself as being above such behavior and refused to participate in any discussion he deemed to lack merit. As Lafayette himself wrote of his introduction into the high society of Versailles, quote, "The favor I enjoyed among the young nobility was short-lived because of my unfavorable impression caused by my silence." I listened and observed, but my awkward country manners and a certain degree of self-respect made it impossible for me to adapt entirely to the required graces of the court." End quote. One of Lafayette's classmates in particular would provide a stark contrast to himself: Charles Philippe, the Comte d'Artois. The Comte d'Artois was the youngest grandson of the aging King Louis XV, and would have been 12 years old when Lafayette first made his acquaintance. While Charles Philippe's older brother, Louis Auguste, may have been next in line for the throne, the Comte d'Artois was widely considered to be the best of the three brothers. He was, by all accounts, dashing, handsome, and refined, and he glided effortlessly through the often tumultuous social circles of Versailles. In early 1774, Lafayette and Adrienne were informed of their betrothal. Adrienne was positively ecstatic, while Lafayette took the news in a more reserved manner. Apparently, Adrienne had harbored feelings for Lafayette from the moment he had come to live with the family. It would take Lafayette some time before he was able to fully reciprocate these feelings, but at the time he considered himself lucky that he was to be married to Adrienne, whom he knew to be kind, gentle, and pretty. The wedding took place, with the king's blessing, on April 11th, 1774, at the chapel of the Hôtel de Noailles in Paris. The Archbishop of Paris presided over the ceremony, which was attended by some 30 guests of the bride and 9 of the groom. Once the ceremony concluded, the bride and groom were joined by dozens more guests for a sumptuous banquet at the Noailles mansion. The menu for the feast included over 200 different dishes. At the end of the banquet, the newlyweds retired to separate chambers, as the final condition of the Duchesse Diane was that her daughter retain her virginity until she was yet older. On May 10th, a month after Lafayette and Adrienne's wedding, Louis XV, King of France, died. Having ascended to the throne at the rather young age of 5, the nearly 60-year reign of Louis XV was the second longest in the history of the French monarchy, second only to that of his predecessor, Louis XIV. The final years of Louis XV's rule had been, in several respects, characterized by stagnation. But if observers believed that his successor, his 20-year-old grandson Louis Auguste, now styled as King Louis XVI, would breathe new and dynamic life into the monarchy, they would be sorely mistaken. Much has been written of the character of Louis XVI, the man who was fated to become the final monarch of the old regime. To begin with, the new king was not the most sociable individual. He much preferred solitary activities like reading and, curiously enough, locksmithing to the company of others. Despite being groomed to do so since birth, the king had always been hesitant to take on the responsibilities that his new position entailed. Not helping matters was the fact that the kingdom's finances lay in disarray thanks to decades of mismanagement. When one also takes into account the increasingly urgent need for political reform, Louis XVI faced a series of obstacles that even a far more capable leader would have struggled to overcome. Though, to be fair to the king, it is a matter of debate as to whether or not it would have been possible for the monarchy as an institution to overcome these aforementioned challenges in any case, regardless of the personality and disposition of the individual on the throne, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. If the new king had somewhat of an asocial personality, then his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, was quite the opposite. Marie Antoinette remains infamous in the modern day as a symbol of the decadence and stark inequality that existed in pre-revolutionary France. This perception of her is certainly not a recent development, as she was quite infamous in her own time as well, especially among her subjects. There were a few different reasons for this. For one, Marie Antoinette was not French, but Austrian, the daughter of Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa and her husband, Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. Marie Antoinette had been married to Louis in 1770, the intention behind this union having been to strengthen the alliance between France and Austria. Prior to 1756, these two countries traditionally saw each other as rivals, and while France and Austria had been allied to each other during the 7 Years' War, many in France still harbored resentment towards the Austrians, some even blaming them for France's humiliating defeat in that conflict. Marie Antoinette may have been able to overcome this original sin of her Austrian origin had she made a concerted effort to ingratiate herself to the common people of France, but she did not do this. On a personal level, she and Louis were not a good match for each other. She resented her husband for his indolence and lack of charm, and a short time after the wedding, the couple had effectively become estranged. Despite having been married for 4 years at the time that Louis ascended to the throne, the couple had yet to produce any children. thus leading to widespread rumors that the king was impotent. Modern scholarship disputes this claim and instead suggests that he had some sort of medical disorder that made sexual intercourse rather painful and unpleasant for him. In any event, once she became queen, Marie Antoinette stole the spotlight from her husband and became the central figure in Versailles' social scene. She cultivated a close-knit circle, and together she and her noble friends engaged in all manner of social events that befitted people of their stature: masquerades, dances, banquets, and so on. As one observer wrote of one of Marie Antoinette's weekly galas, quote, "It is impossible to see anything but the queen. She is a statue of beauty when standing or sitting, grace itself when she moves. She was dressed in silver, scattered over with roses, diamonds, and feathers," end quote. Despite being adjacent to the queen's clique, Lafayette continued to feel ill at ease around her and his fellow noblemen. Nevertheless, he never lost his innate desire to fit in. He attended such events as the one described above whenever he was invited, and constantly tried to affect the mannerisms of his acquaintances, often failing in spectacular fashion. The Comte de la Marque, a contemporary of Lafayette's from whom I quoted earlier, recounted one incident at one of these cotillions during which Lafayette, quote, "proved himself to be so maladroit at dancing that the queen could not stop herself from laughing at him," end quote. Embarrassing episodes like this only served to motivate Lafayette to find some way to extricate himself from the society to which he felt he did not and perhaps could never truly belong. To Lafayette, the prospect of military service appeared to offer a way out. As a wedding gift, Lafayette's father-in-law had secured for him an officer's commission in the family's regiment, the Noailles Dragoons. This was no trifling matter for the Duke. Seeing as how Lafayette was still a child, it took quite a bit of money and a written assurance that the boy would not take an active role in commanding the regiment until he came of age to secure for him a position. Still, Lafayette was quite pleased by this development, and in the summer of 1774, a few months after his wedding, he was sent to the regimental headquarters in the western border city of Metz. There he was to undergo basic training and to get a sense of what an officer's life was like. It was during this time in Metz that Lafayette was introduced to two men who would become his lifelong friends. One of these men was his brother-in-law, Louis, Vicomte de Noailles. Lafayette quickly befriended the Vicomte, not only due to their family ties, but also because he admired the fact that Noailles possessed all the social graces that he himself seemed to lack. The other close friend Lafayette made at this time was named Louis Philippe, the Comte de Ségur. A student of history destined for a career in the diplomatic service, Ségur and Lafayette started off as adversaries. Lafayette spent days trying to get Ségur to face him in a duel for some trivial reason or other, but after some time the two reconciled their differences and became fast friends. After spending the summer in Metz, Lafayette, along with his newfound friends, Ségur and Noailles, returned to Versailles. Here, Lafayette once again found himself struggling to keep up with the decadent and fast-paced lifestyle that his acquaintances seemed to so effortlessly maintain. One anecdote to this effect recounts a time when Lafayette engaged in an excessive amount of drinking in the hopes of impressing his brother-in-law, who had a reputation for being able to hold his liquor. After having to literally be carried into his carriage, Lafayette told his companions to inform the Vicomte de Noailles about how much he drank that night. Another telling incident occurred after Lafayette's father-in-law attempted to secure for him an appointment to the entourage of the Comte de Provence, the younger brother of the king. In doing so, the Duc d'Ayen believed that he was doing Lafayette a favor, but he was so horrified by the prospect of permanently being attached to the Comte de Provence, whom he personally disliked, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. One night, he ran into Provence at a masked ball and insulted him directly to his face. Giving Lafayette the benefit of the doubt, the Comte offered him an opportunity to apologize for the slight, but Lafayette refused, effectively ruining any chance he would have had to be in his entourage. The Duc d'Ayen was furious at Lafayette for squandering this opportunity that he had gone out of his way to give him. In his defense, Lafayette said, quote, "I did not hesitate to be disagreeable to preserve my independence," end quote. Also at this time, Lafayette, at the encouragement of his friends Noailles and Ségur, attempted to take a mistress. Unusual as it may seem to our modern sensibilities, it was perfectly acceptable for young French noblemen to carry on extramarital affairs. In fact, it was more or less expected of them, so long as they remained reasonably discreet about it. Lafayette tried his luck with a few different women, but none of these attempts mounted to anything. Perhaps as a result of this lack of success, it was also at this time that Lafayette and Adrienne began to defy the ban on sleeping with each other, and by the spring of 1775, Adrienne was pregnant with their first child. In the summer of 1775, Lafayette returned to Metz once again. He was about to turn 18 in September, at which point he would be allowed to take an active role in commanding his regiment. In the meantime, Lafayette became acquainted with the commander of the Metz garrison, Charles François, Comte de Broglie. Broglie was thought of as a larger-than-life personality, and traits like this served him well in his long career as both an army officer and diplomat. One of his many admirers was the Virginia statesman and future president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who described him as, quote, a high-flying aristocrat, cool and capable of everything, end quote. His gregarious but amiable nature concealed his penchant for backroom scheming. This reputation and his lack of personal connections to the current king were responsible for his relatively unimpressive posting as the commander of a peacetime garrison town. But under the previous king, Louis XV, Broglie was a prominent member of something referred to as Le Secret du Roi, or the King's Secret. As the name suggests, this was a clandestine diplomatic ministry, almost a kind of precursor to modern foreign intelligence agencies like the CIA. The agents of this secret network were answerable only to the king, and they were entrusted to carry out actions that involved potentially sensitive matters. During the 7 Years' War, and for many years afterwards, most of their activities revolved finding ways to undermine Great Britain to little avail. The group was effectively disbanded after the death of Louis XV, though its agents quietly continued their work from their official positions in the French government, Broglie included. Naturally, they had long had an eye on the developments in Britain's colonies in North America, especially as tensions there steadily rose between the colonists and the British Crown. Anyway, Lafayette soon became very close with Broglie, who invited the young man into his inner circle. It is also very likely that Broglie at this time invited Lafayette to join the Order of the Freemasons. Due to their secretive nature and the several powerful figures who have been involved with the organization, the Freemasons have become the subject of numerous conspiracy theories throughout their history. Some have seen them as a sort of invisible hand guiding all developments in society and politics, but there has been a sort of tendency to overplay the influence that the organization itself had. During this period, the Freemasons primarily devoted themselves to propagating the ideals of the Enlightenment, notions like rationalism and meritocracy. It's no coincidence that the Masons counted among their ranks several leaders of the nascent American Revolution, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. The Freemasons viewed the rebellion of the American colonists not as a simple revolt against excessive taxation, but as an epical struggle of man's right to life, liberty, and property against tyranny. Such ideals naturally appealed to the independent-minded and freedom-loving Lafayette. On August 8, 1775, Broglie invited Lafayette and other local members of the order to dine with a very prominent guest, Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester, the younger brother of King George III of Great Britain. The prince strongly disapproved of his brother's stance towards the American colonists, and he had become a prominent spokesperson for the American cause in Europe. At this meeting, the prince discussed recent developments in the colonies. He told the others of the battles that had occurred at Lexington and Concord earlier that year, when a ragtag group of American colonists took up arms against the British Army and managed to fight them off. He also told them about the leader of this nascent rebellion, a wealthy land surveyor and tobacco farmer from Virginia named George Washington. He spoke of Washington in admiration, pointing out that he risked being executed for treason if the rebellion failed. In the opinion of the prince, these American colonists had every conceivable right to rebel against the rule of his brother. The plight of the American colonists instantly inflamed Lafayette's imagination. After the dinner with Prince William, he wrote down his thoughts in a journal, quote, "Such a glorious cause had never before rallied the attention of mankind. Oppressors and oppressed would receive a powerful lesson. The great work would be accomplished, or the rights of humanity would fall beneath its ruin. The destiny of France and that of her rival England would be decided at the very same moment. I gave my heart to the Americans and thought of nothing else but raising my banner and adding my colors to theirs." In my estimation, the American cause appealed to Lafayette both on a personal level and in ways that were much larger than himself. Going off the quote I just read, it's clear that there were ideological and nationalistic sentiments at play here. As I've hopefully made clear this far, Lafayette was a highly idealistic person, passionate about notions of liberty, freedom, and so on. But he also had a strong sense of pride for his native country, hence his excitement at the prospect of taking down Britain by a peg or two. Of course, He not only would be avenging the national humiliation that France suffered during the 7 Years' War, but he would also be avenging the death of his father during that same conflict. Then one can also factor in some other personal motivations. His desire to find fame and glory on the battlefield, to distinguish himself from his peers at Versailles, and finally win their admiration. His desire to find a cause that he believed was worth fighting for. But in a more immediate sense, it may well have been that Lafayette saw this as the only opportunity he had to accomplish these things, on account of some recent reforms within the French military that I will explain in short order. Upon ascending to the throne, one of the most pressing tasks for King Louis XVI was to enact military reform. France's defeat in the 7 Years' War was very much within recent memory, and there was a widespread belief that major changes had to be made to the military for the kingdom to stand a chance in their next major conflict. The king entrusted his newly appointed Minister of War, Claude Louis the Comte de Saint-Germain, to handle these efforts. For Saint-Germain, this was a matter as personal as it was professional. Like Lafayette, Saint-Germain was the scion of rural nobility, hailing from the region of Franche-Comté in eastern France. He distinguished himself in battle during the last war, but was passed over time and again for promotions by others who possessed more wealth or better connections at court than he did. In his memoirs, he lamented the state of the officer corps. Quote, "The army's pernicious distinction between the nobility of the court and the nobility of the provinces, between the rich and the poor, is such that one has everything without meriting anything, and that the other gets nothing no matter what they merit." End quote. From his position as the Minister of War, Saint-Germain now had the opportunity to embark in a whole-scale reorganization of the army along meritocratic lines, an opportunity to right the systemic wrongs that had for so long stymied his career and those of countless others. Saint-Germain singled out the old family regiments, like Lafayette's regiment, the Noailles Dragoons, as being a major root of the underlying problem. To him, these units were vestiges of the Middle Ages, breeding grounds for the corruption that was endemic in the army. In particular, he sought to weed out the young noblemen who found themselves serving in the officer corps through no merit of their own but thanks to familial ties. The 18-year-old Lafayette, whose father-in-law had pulled all the necessary strings to get him into his position, appeared to be the perfect example of this type of individual. Ultimately, Saint-Germain did not remain in his office for very long, on account of mounting opposition to his far-reaching reforms, but he had been there long enough to compile a list of suspected nepotism cases in the officer corps. On June 11, 1776, the king signed a decree removing all those named by Saint-Germain, Lafayette among them, from the roster of active duty military personnel. These men were not ejected from the army outright, but placed in the reserves to be called up for active duty in the event of war. But with no imminent prospect of war, this change would effectively be indefinite. For Lafayette, this was devastating news. His budding military career suddenly evaporated into nothing before his eyes, and his entire future now seemed uncertain. Further complicating matters was the fact that he was now a father. Adrienne gave birth to a daughter, Henriette, in December 1775. It was not fatherhood in itself that troubled Lafayette, as much as the fear that he would not be able to pursue a career in the military, as he felt was expected of him on account of his ancestry. Realistically, Lafayette's future prospects were not quite as bleak as he may have believed at the time. He still had the extensive land holdings he'd inherited, and he could have secured for himself a position in the bureaucracy, perhaps with the assistance of his father-in-law. But the fact of the matter was that Lafayette never seriously considered a career path other than the military. It had been his ambition to join the army since his grandmother first filled his head with tales of chivalric glory of his ancestors. As it happened, the ongoing conflict in America appeared to offer him an opportunity. On July 6, 1776, 2 days after the American Declaration of Independence was ratified by the Second Continental Congress, a 38-year-old lawyer-turned-merchant from Connecticut named Silas Deane arrived in Paris. Officially, Deane was in Paris on behalf of a group of merchants in British North America who were, as he put it, quote, engaged in the business of providing goods for the Indian trade, end quote. In reality, Deane was in Paris on a clandestine mission entrusted him by the Continental Congress to solicit military aid from France. In many respects, an alliance between the Catholic absolutist monarchy of France and the Protestant English-descended Republicans of the nascent United States appeared improbable, divided as they were by barriers of language, religion, form of government, and a mutual suspicion based on a long history of conflict. After all, long-standing animosities between the two had been a major factor leading to the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. But now the two had an enemy in common. There was widespread sympathy among the French public towards the struggle of the American insurgents, as they referred to them. The Americans themselves became quasi-celebrities in France, especially to young men like Lafayette, whose education on the Greek and Roman classics inspired in them a love of Republican liberty. As his friend Ségur mused, the Americans appeared to be, quote, like some wise contemporaries of Plato, or Republicans from the time of Cato and Fabius, end quote. Ségur also commented on how the Americans' unusual mannerisms won them the admiration of the French. Quote, nothing was more surprising than the contrast between the luxury of our capital, the elegance of our fashions, the magnificence of Versailles, and the Americans who arrived in their almost rustic dress, simple but proud in bearing, free and direct language, hair without preparation or powder. In short, this antique air that seemed to have carried itself suddenly inside our walls. So taken was France with the Americans and their cause that opinions from every quarter pressed the royal government to declare itself on the side of Republican liberty. End quote. Inclined as they may have been to offer material aid to the American rebels, there were serious diplomatic ramifications the French government had to consider before attempting such a move. The British government had made it abundantly clear that they considered the rebellion to be an internal matter. Becoming involved in the conflict, directly or indirectly, meant that France risked war against Great Britain, a war that they were, as of that moment, unprepared to fight. Moreover, the kingdom's financial situation was such that providing assistance to the rebels appeared irresponsible. As I mentioned, the past several decades of financial mismanagement during the reign of the previous king, expenses related to the 7 Years' War had left the government in a profound amount of debt. The amount of revenue the state was able to take in was also severely limited by France's archaic system of taxation. Further complicating matters, the recent deregulation of the grain trade and a particularly poor harvest year had led to acute shortages of food in the country, which in turn caused civil unrest. In these circumstances, most of the king's ministers believed that pledging support to the American rebels was ill-advised. That said, there were still a few people in positions of influence that believed the potential rewards of such a course of action outweighed the risks. Among them was the king's foreign minister, Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes. Vergennes was totally convinced that a defeat for Britain could only play to France's benefit. As he wrote in a letter to the king, quote, the power of England will diminish and ours will increase accordingly. Her commerce will suffer an irreparable loss while ours will increase. It is even probable that we might be able to recover part of the possessions the English seized from us in America, such as Canada. End quote. Vergennes had been observing the situation in North America well before the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, and shortly after the War of Independence began, he opened a diplomatic back-channel with the rebellious colonists. Which brings us back to Silas Deane. His mission to France had been arranged at a meeting between an agent representing Vergennes and Benjamin Franklin in late December 1775. Deane's instructions from the Continental Congress were relatively modest. He was to acquire from the French the services of 4 military engineers, as well as clothing and weapons for 25,000 men, 100 heavy cannons, and all the requisite ammunition. At his first meeting with Deane, Vergennes indicated that his government was willing to offer the Americans far more than Congress requested. They offered to sell them 2 million livres worth of artillery, gunpowder, uniforms, bayonets, and so on. Enough supplies and equipment to fully load 10 ships. Deane was well aware that Congress was not able to pay such a large sum at the moment, but unable to contact them, he felt pressured to accept the French offer. Meanwhile, in North America, news that the British were forced to withdraw from the city of Boston raised hopes in both America and in France that the colonists actually stood a decent chance of victory. Unfortunately for them, that was the last piece of good news to come out of the colonies for quite some time. A formal Declaration of Independence was signed and ratified of July of that year, and about a month later, the British attacked and decisively defeated the Continental Army at the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, subsequently capturing New York City. News of this defeat convinced many that the Continental Army was in desperate need of some European military expertise. Vergennes was so perturbed that he briefly contemplated having George Washington replaced by a French generalissimo, but nothing came of this scheme. Still, it was clear that more experienced military officers were needed to help lead the Continental Army. Silas Deane, still in Paris at that time, tried to recruit French officers to come to America. As it turned out, the military reforms initiated by Saint-Germain resulted in the removal of hundreds of French army officers from active duty. Like Lafayette, many of these men had been bitterly disappointed by this and were willing to go to great lengths to advance their military careers. It was not very long before Dean was feeling, in his words, quote, well nigh harassed to death, end quote, by the multitude of reserve officers practically begging him for a chance to go to America. And so it came as somewhat of a relief when Baron Johann de Kalb, a German-born officer in the French army, offered him his services as a sort of unofficial chief of staff. One may be surprised to learn that the Baron de Kalb was actually not of noble birth. He hailed from a family of commoners in a tiny German principality not far from Nuremberg. He received a decent education, becoming fluent enough in French that he was able to enlist in the French army, and it was by distinguishing himself in battle that he was awarded the title of Baron in 1763. Now, 13 years later, de Kalb, who was also fluent in English, offered to assist the beleaguered Dean by helping him screen the deluge of applicants eager to travel to the New World. By December 1776, de Kalb had compiled a list of 16 officers whom he recommended to be enlisted in the Continental Army. He had convinced Dean to not only enroll all of these officers in the army, but to give them generous salaries and ranks that did not necessarily benefit their actual level of expertise, under the assumption that such incentives were necessary to ensure their loyalty to a cause that was not their own. Dean also appointed de Kalb to the rank of Major General, a rank which was surpassed only by Washington himself. Naturally, Lafayette had caught wind of Dean's recruitment efforts, and at some point in the autumn of 1776, he, along with his two close friends, Noailles and Ségur, decided to offer their services. As Ségur put it, the trio, quote, vowed to right the wrongs of the last war, to fight the English and to fly to the aid of the Americans, end quote. But getting there would be no easy matter. Legally speaking, all three of them were still minors, and as such they had to ask permission from their families. Both Noailles and Ségur did this, but Lafayette, anticipating a negative response, decided not to. As he later recalled, quote, circumstances had taught me to expect nothing but obstacles from my family, and therefore I counted on myself, end quote. Lafayette went directly to the Comte de Broglie and asked him if he could secure for him a meeting with Dean and de Kalb. Initially, Broglie made a show of refusal, telling Lafayette, quote, I witnessed your father's death at the Battle of Minden, and I will not be accessory to the total ruin of the only remaining branch of your family, end quote. But Lafayette was nothing if not insistent, and, after some badgering, Broglie relented. With his sizable fortune, Lafayette, unlike the other officers who had approached Dean thus far, did not ask for a huge salary. He did, however, request to be given the rank of Major General. His complete lack of actual battlefield experience made this a hard sell. As Lafayette recalled, quote, I spoke more of my ardor in the cause than of my experience, and I dwelt much upon the effect my departure would excite in France, end quote. Over the course of future interviews, Lafayette suggested that continued support from the French government would be contingent on him receiving the rank that he asked for. This seems to have convinced Dean, who wrote Lafayette a formal letter of recommendation to Congress. In this letter, Dean said that Lafayette was deserving of the rank on account of, quote, his high birth, his aliases, the great dignities his family holds at court, his considerable estates in this realm, his personal merit, his reputation, his disinterestedness, and above all, his zeal for the liberty of our provinces, end quote. On December 7th, 1776, Dean finalized Lafayette's enlistment papers, which included the following addendum, quote, on the conditions here explained, I offer myself, and promise to depart when and how Mr. Dean shall judge proper, to serve the United States with all possible zeal, without any pension or particular allowance, reserving myself to the liberty of returning to Europe when my family or my king shall recall me. Done at Paris on this 7th day of December, 1776. End quote. At the same time, he signed these papers, formally registering him in the Continental Army. Another issue arose. The Prime Minister of France, bowing to British pressure, issued an order forbidding any French army personnel from joining the Continental Army. Under this order, the port authorities in the city of Le Havre impounded the two vessels destined for America, of which the Baron de Kalb was scheduled to travel aboard. Here, Lafayette saw an opportunity to demonstrate his devotion to the cause. Using 112,000 livres of his own money, Lafayette purchased an old merchant vessel, subsequently rechristened as La Victoire, or the Victory. The Victory was rather cumbersome and slow, and its paltry 6 cannons could hardly be relied upon if the ship was ever attacked. but still, Lafayette thought the vessel to be perfectly suitable for his purposes. It's possible that by this point Lafayette's family had begun to suspect something was awry. Perhaps hoping to interrupt whatever it was that he was planning, the Duke d'Ayen sent him on a trip abroad in February 1777, ironically to London of all places. Lafayette spent a total of 3 weeks there, living in the company of his uncle-in-law, the French ambassador to Great Britain. It was there that a bit of good news reached him from the colonies. On Christmas of the previous year, George Washington had led a daring raid against the Hessians, German mercenaries under the employ of the British Crown, at Trenton in New Jersey. The victory at Trenton reversed the recent string of American defeats and lifted the spirits of Lafayette, who openly toasted to the Americans' victory. Also during his stay in London, he was presented at the court of King George III. One can only imagine the emotions that he must have felt upon entering the presence of the man whose rule he had already sworn to overthrow. In March, Lafayette returned to France from his English diversion. His ship, the Victory, was nearly prepared to set sail. In the weeks leading up to his departure, he purposely spent as little time at the Noailles residence as possible. Writing from a Parisian apartment he briefly rented with the Calbe, he wrote 2 letters, one to his wife, the other to his father-in-law. To Adrienne, who was then pregnant with their second child, Lafayette expressed his great regret at leaving her at such a moment, but pleaded with her for her understanding. His letter to the Duc d'Ayen tried unconvincingly to put a more positive spin on the whole thing. Quote, "You will be astonished, my dear father, at what I have to say to you. I have found a unique opportunity to distinguish myself and to learn my soldier's trade. I am a general officer in the Army of the United States of America. My zeal for their cause and my sincerity have won their confidence. I shall embark on a vessel that I myself have purchased and chartered. My traveling companions are the Baron de Kalb, a very distinguished officer, a brigadier in the King's service, and like me, a major general in the United States Army, and some excellent officers who wish to share in my daring enterprise. I am overjoyed at having found such a glorious opportunity. This will not be a long trip. Every day people take far longer trips just for pleasure. And besides, I hope to return to you more worthy of all those who are kind enough to miss me. Your affectionate son, Lafayette." End quote. These messages did not reassure anyone. Adrienne was practically inconsolable while the Duc d'Ayen flew into a rage. He wrote to the king himself about the situation, prompting Louis XVI to issue a proclamation reiterating his ban on French officers traveling to America, singling out Lafayette by name. By that time, the Victoire had already set sail from the port of Bordeaux, but instead of heading directly across the Atlantic, it stopped briefly at a small port just across the border with Spain to await a message from Versailles authorizing their departure. Lafayette had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that his father-in-law, when faced with the fait accompli of his departure, would give his blessing to the mission. The letter that did reach Lafayette was a harsh remonstrance, not from the Duke, but from the king. He was ordered to immediately reverse course and go to the French port of Marseille. Worse, he was informed that the king had issued a lettre de cachet in his name. A lettre de cachet being a royal order, allowing for the arbitrary detention of any subject who, for whatever reason, had displeased the king. Facing all of this pressure, Lafayette very nearly lost his nerve and considered calling off the whole adventure, but just before he could do so, he was contacted by the Vicomte de Monroy, an associate of Broglie. He told Lafayette that the king and his government secretly supported him in his endeavor, and that the threat to issue a lettre de cachet was merely an empty gesture. While it was true that his father-in-law vehemently disapproved of Lafayette's actions, Monroy reported that he was practically the only one who had this view, and that nearly everyone else at Versailles supported him. Lafayette, perhaps being predisposed to believe him, took him at his word, and so, on April 20th, 1777, Lafayette set off for America, where destiny awaited him. And that is a good place, I think, to end the narrative for today. In the next episode, 2 weeks from now, we will follow Lafayette as he makes his voyage across the Atlantic and as he first sets foot in the New World. In the meantime, any and all questions, comments, and concerns can be directed to my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter and Facebook, and on the show's website if you're so inclined. Links to all of these will be available in the episode's description. Also, consider purchasing some used books from me if you'd like to help support the show financially. Until 2 weeks from now, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening, as always. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
qui a l'aristocrate dit mea culpa.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le clergé regrette le bien qu'il a, par justice la nation l'aura, par le prudent Lafayette, tout trouble s'apaisera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, réjouissons-nous, le bon temps viendra.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée,
ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
le peuple abri toujours se gardera. Le vrai d'avec le faux l'on connaîtra, le citoyen pour le bien soutiendra.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au délire ira, sans avoir à le troubler. Toujours le plus fort sera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, le peuple armé.